Thank you, Robert. And first of all, I'd like to thank Miguel and the book list for hosting this. It's wonderful to have a spot after Beit Zaitoun is closed. We don't have a place to organize for this very important work, Palestinian solidarity. So book list is holding the fort at this point. Also like to thank the Native people, as has become a tradition now. But I'd like to focus on the Six Nations, which is our closest Indian community just south of Brantford. And I'd also like to thank the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe, that is in Manitoba, Ontario, into Quebec, Algonquin, Mississauga. It's a group of tribes based on language. And I'm very happy that the ex-chief of the Anishinaabe Rousseau River in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, he endorsed my book, Terry Nelson. We've become good friends in the last while, and I'm very happy to know him and to work with him on, we're very much of like minds about how to deal with Native problems, and in both countries, in Canada and in Israel. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, say, why did I write this book? Well, primarily I felt such shame at being a Canadian. I felt ashamed. After 10 years of Harper, thank you, Stephen Harper, for inspiring me to write this book, because Canada became over the top in terms of kowtowing to the imperial powers. Now it was not Britain as it was in the past. It's not just the US, it's US-Israel, as I call the empire in my first book, Postmodern Imperialism, because they are the only modern nations on our side, quote unquote. U.S., the imperial side, there are no competing imperial powers anymore. The U.S., its intention was to be the sole superpower, the New World Order. 1991, this is when it was inaugurated, and it quickly began to fall apart. But in any case, we are part of that, what's still nominally the US-Israeli control of world affairs. Now, the only countries that are outside of that are, you can tell me yourself, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, a few smaller South American countries, and of course China. China's it plays along with the imperialists. There's not really much difference so far. We're still waiting for China to step out of its postmodern role. By postmodern, I mean that you don't have a foreign policy. You're not really an independent country. It just looks like you're independent. We call ourselves Canadian. We've got a flag, we've got a constitution, but we have no foreign policy. And that really is the litmus test. So the countries that do have a foreign policy, it's of course opposed then to the imperial policy, they are the enemy. So I think that we still have this Cold War mentality, unfortunately. So anyway, the shame, I had to deal with that. I wanted to understand how we got to this point and how we can get out of it. So it really it needs not just a litany of all the bad things that Canada does and Israel does, but to look at how the whole economic system produced that. Israel's not a coincidence, and neither is Canada in its own very passive role in the world affairs. It's all part of a system. So at that point, I'd like to thank. This is part of the exhibition, but it fits the topic to a T. So obviously, Austin Clarke, is a black thinker. He is aware of the real motive force behind the world. And thank you, Lenin. Imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. And so we can thank Lenin for his insights. And again, we can thank Israel. Israel is the classical case of imperialism on a small scale, and in a very short, in a 70-year period, it's accomplished what it took maybe 400 years. And it's actually ahead of Canada now. You could say Canada was like an older brother. We got our independence in 1931. the Statutes of Westminster. That's when we actually had our own control over our own policies and had a possibility to have a foreign policy. And Israel, 1948. Of course, Canada never really used its independence. It was a very brief period from 31 to 40, really to 46, 47, when the NATO begins and Canada becomes part of the American Empire officially. So there was that short period. And the one time it was used, our independence, was Mackenzie King. He told Britain, don't declare war on our behalf, please. You did that World War I. No, we're going to declare our own war against Hitler, against Germany. So that he delayed Canada's entry into World War II by 1 week, just to show that we have an independent foreign policy. So very, very much tokenism, and that whole idea just really disappeared. We don't really have any foreign policy. So there's Lenin. Thank you, Lenin. And what I'm doing with this book, it's really volume 4 of what I've been working on in the last, well, really all my life, I suppose. But the idea is to do a case study of postmodern imperialism. And that's what this is. It's looking at Israel and Canada, how they developed as colonial nations, how they fit into the imperial order today. And there's similarities, there are differences. So that is in a nutshell. Now, one of the things that also that inspired me is the urgency of this issue, why I had to write it now. I think we have a window of opportunity to some extent, that Israel is so outrageous, and the UN, it backed down in 1975, it declared Zionism as racism. And that caused a great furor. Israel was furious, the US was furious, but there was something called the Soviet Union, and it had a seat on the Security Council, and it had followers. There was a strong socialist force in world politics in 1975. That was probably the height of the anti-imperialist force. So the UN was moved by that and declared something true that it was afraid to before. Now that resolution was rescinded. Do any of you know when it was cancelled? No takers? Well, the Soviet Union was the main backbone, I would say. And when did the Soviet Union collapse? 1991. Within months, it was off the UN agenda. In fact, it might have even been before the collapse, because already the Soviet Union had lost its credibility by 1991 as a force for socialism, unfortunately. And that is when the UN really was put back in its place. But what happened just as I was writing this book I was putting it to press last September, there was a resolution from the UN that Israel is apartheid. And again, it caused great scandal. Within an hour or two of it being posted, it was quickly pulled off the UN site. But it was there, and it represents a new push within the UN. And there have been other ones. The Goldstone Report, there's Richard Falk, that have, and there's a Canadian, I'm not sure, lawyer who's also victimized by the Zionists because he was trying to investigate the situation in the occupied territories. I don't quite have his name, it's in my book. Michael Lane. And he was also raked over the coals. So these incidents within the UN, you can see that there is a barometer. The UN's a little bit like a barometer. It was down and now it's moving up. And I think there is a real possibility of moving forward. But the only way we can really do that in Canada is to have the natives as part of, and I use the word natives, Indigenous, First Nations. I thought about this, and really, I talked to Terry, he said that's fine. Natives is fine. And it just, so I have got my, I have been given an okay by a native leader, by an Indigenous leader, to use the term native, because I don't want my prose to be lumpy and jerky. So, but it's got to be not native Canadians, it's Canadian natives. Because the first priority, the highest signifier is always the last word. So it should be Jewish Canadians, right? And not Canadian Jews, not Canadian Swedes. You know, I have a Swedish background, but I don't think of myself as Swedish. I love the heritage, and it's part of me, and I can say grace in Swedish, and I like meatballs, and, you know, la 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 la. But it's an ethnic identification, and thank you, Len. And my first signifier is Canadian. So I started out ashamed to be a Canadian. By the time I finished this book, I was proud to be a Canadian. You know, that's my highest signifier. And I think that if we have to have a loyalty test, that's okay by me to be, you know, if I have to swear allegiance to Canada, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. I don't see any problem with that. That's a little bit of background, the urgency then. So there's the South Africa. This is much like 30 years ago with the fight to end apartheid in South Africa. And that succeeded. That was wonderful. It's a wonderful drama. And I'm glad to be a part of that. And I look on that struggle very fondly. Mind you, they were in a much better position because there was still the Soviet Union there. There was still a force for social justice on the world, in world politics, which there isn't now at all. So that's a real, you could say, handicap that the Palestinians have that the blacks didn't have. Also, the Palestinians don't have a strong lobby. The blacks in South Africa at least had the blacks in the States. And in the 70s and 80s, that was the height of black power, and they were a greater force. And also, with the confluence of the international scene, with the Soviet Union, all of that allowed South Africa to be liberated. But it was a hard struggle, but it won. So I don't know. The Palestinians don't have those advantages, and there's this incredible Israeli Jewish lobby in North America that really keeps media in control, keeps the news out of the news. So that is we have these drawbacks, but we have young people, the new generations, people come and they look for social justice. That's why the students are so important at any time, that if you're facing this bad international situation, students and our own natives, because they have suffered the same that the Palestinians have suffered. And they are now more resilient, moving forward with their own struggle for land, the same struggle that the Palestinians have. So I think if we can really work together, and natives have a real power of, they have their own soft power here, that people do respect native traditions now. We realize we lost so much by destroying native culture, and Canadians really, when I think of myself as a Canadian, I think of myself, you know, natives, the native culture, that's the Canadian culture. And I want to be inspired and derive inspiration from that rather than from the colonial heritage. You can't get away from the colonial heritage, and I studied at Cambridge. That was probably the most formative period in my life. Britain has an incredible wealth of intellectual tradition, so it's good to really combine both. You've got to really be able to look at both sides. And also this book, I don't just look at the colonial, I don't look at the colonizers. I do. I look at Britain. I look at and the Canadians came in. They were the colonizers. They were the part of that colonial regime to dispossess the natives. And also the same with the Israelis. The East European Jews came and they dispossessed the Palestinians. And they were white, just the way the white colonizers of Canada. So there are many parallels there. And as I was talking with Sarah just before, she went on a birthright trip as a Jewish youth. And she was saying how it's important to see, she wanted to see inside the young Israelis' mind. How do they think? What are these students, what are these ex-soldiers? How did they see their time in the IDF? I think that's very important to be able to see both sides of the struggle. And that is something that I try to do. This is the postmodern. It's a broad term, postmodern. I told you what it means in geopolitical terms, but in theoretical terms, philosophical terms, it also means to be deconstruct, to look inside, look at both sides, to look at how people think, because all of history is from here. It's coming from people's minds. So you have to really use a lot of psychology. That's why this book, I really try to do that. I have the psychology, the culture, the history, the philosophy as well, the philosophy of capitalism and imperialism, how that all, you have to really combine all of these elements in any kind of postmodern analysis. So that's the background to why I wrote it. Actually, there's a couple people that I wanted to mention that really encapsulate. This is the Canada Israel Nexus. Robert said, make sure you keep it Canada Israel. Well, everything is Canada Israel when it comes down to it. Hannah Arendt, I discovered her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1961, on the Eichmann trial. And that I had to look at that because I was looking at the Holocaust deniers of the 1980s, which are crucial to understanding Canadian-Israeli relations and how Zionists tried to use their power to really pummel and to go after anyone that was criticizing their agenda, even no matter how puny and silly maybe they are. So I had to look at her analysis. And I was blown away. She attacked Ben Gurion and the whole leadership, how they were using this Eichmann trial. They were turning it into a show trial, partly to gain more, to bilk more money out of Germany. It was already paying for I think it was half of the GDP or half of the budget of Israel at one point was being paid for by German reparations in the 50s. So Germany had really paid a lot already, and it paid much more. It's still paying today, I believe. And now we hear that Poland is, the Zionists want Poland to pay as well. Poor Poland, it lost 3 million as opposed to the Jewish, whatever. The numbers are higher, definitely. Some 6, Yad Vashem, is that? Yad Vashem says 4.7. That's their count to date. So the numbers issue and the whole Holocaust denial business, that was fascinating to look at. People said, why are you talking about this? People are going to be angry, or say, it's important. It's part of our history. And I'm really glad I did that, because I could see that these people, they weren't, they were bigoted perhaps. Zundel, yes. Keegstra, I would say no. And Topham, well, I don't know. These are simple people, and they have that wrong. They have the stories wrong, but they're not trying to kill anybody. So the idea of hating, it was a mistake. But anyway, we can go back and look at that, because the Zionists really lost. On Zundel, they lost big time. On other ones, they did gain, but it was a kind of, it's like a crapshoot that they were playing, using the Holocaust as a way to promote their agenda of Greater Israel. So Hannah Arendt is one person that I really came to respect. I recommend you read that. That book is still a classic. And she is the precursor of Finkelstein. She said basically the same thing that Finkelstein said, but she said it, I think, on a great level. I don't want to compare and say who's better or worse, but it's a wonderful book. Another person I'd like to point out, and that really encapsulates Canada Israel, Ben Dunkelman. Is anyone, I see some nods. You know who Ben Dunkelman? Okay. So Dunkelman, do you know what his father was the founder of? Tip Top Tailors. Okay, so he's the classic story of East European Jews coming at the turn of the century. They couldn't become part of the Gentile elite. They were pushed aside. And what did they do? He set up his own business and became one of the richest men in Canada, within a few years. So, if you had chutzpah and you had energy and brains, you got ahead. So this was a promised land. Jews have always had problem in countries where they lived. That there was isolated, alienated, So there was always some kind of residual problem, and that's part of the book too. Why? Does that mean we're all bigots, or does that mean there is a dynamic to Jews in Dunkelman? Getting back to Ben Dunkelman. So his father founded Tip Top Tailors. He couldn't get into the elite, but he. So what do? You set up your own sports center. What's the center that the Bronfman Center, Ryan?
The JCC on Bathurst?
The JCC? No, the one where you play tennis.
Is it Bronfman?
Yeah, is that what it's called? The Bronfman's? No.
I don't think so. They're tennis. They play at the tennis club.
The tennis club. It's Jewish, isn't it?
It started as a Jewish club because they had nowhere else to play.
Right. It started in the 30s or 40s, 50s. Okay. So what happened is you set up your own fancy sports club, and now it's not just Jewish. It's open to anybody. But that's, when you had troubles, you set up your own sports club. You set up your own business. Dunkelman's mother, she was a very strong Zionist. And she wanted to have a summer camp for kids. Couldn't buy the land on Lake Simcoe. You're not allowed to, you're Jewish. What did she do? She got her Gentile friends to buy the land. And a big chunk of Lake Simcoe, and there are cottages there. It's really a whole Jewish area of Lake Simcoe. And the summer camp is thriving, going well. So you could see how even there were these irritants. I would call them irritants. No one was killed. People were going. Doctors were graduating. There were quotas. Well, 10% was the quota. Now this is looked at as shameful, racism. But in fact, Jews were less than 1% of the population. The quota was 10%. McGill, and generally, it was a kind of gentleman's agreement, that Hollywood movie about the racism. So there were this gentleman agreement so that you could get by without the perks necessarily. So that's interesting. And what did he do? He went in the 30s. He did his alley. His mother said, "Go on. You help found the new Jewish state." So he did. He didn't like it very much. I mean, he sort of was two minds. He never stayed in Israel. He came back and fought in the war, got his soldierly status, and then came back in 48. He's part of the fundraising. He slips back into Palestine illegally. It was illegal, but hundreds of Canadian Jews went to Palestine, and they fought in the war. And his autobiography, it's fascinating reading. I recommend it too. It's called Dual Allegiance. And he says at some point in the biography, if Israel, if its needs were greater, Israel is my top priority. So he says quite openly that his dual allegiance is really a threat to Canada, if you want to put it in those terms. But he doesn't say that, of course. And he also, if you Google his name, the first thing that comes up is a Star article that is about how I saved Nazareth. Okay, so he was in the army. He was a brigade leader. He was told to liberate Nazareth. So he gets close. The mayor sees him coming, sticks up the white flag, and says, "I want to see the commander." So Dunkelman goes and talks to them. The mayor says, "You can have Nazareth. I know we're not going to fight. Just don't kick us out. Please leave us in our homes." And he thought, so maybe the Canadian gene kicked in at this point. He said, "Well, it sounds fair enough." So he agreed. But then his commander over him said, "No, you don't. Go and get rid of them. You kick them out, kill them, or whatever." And he said, "No, I'm sorry. I've already made this agreement. I'm not going to go back on it." And the guy tried to fire him. It was actually a Russian immigrant that was over his head. So an East European. Part of the real Israel wave that was forming the state. So he said, "I'm going to go to Ben Gurion." And he knew Ben Gurion. His father's a rich Canadian. Ben Gurion knows all the people. So he goes to Ben Gurion and says, "Okay, you're right. We're not going to get rid of them. You don't worry. Just go back and get back to work." So that was the way he saved Nazareth. But he doesn't go into the war crimes that he committed as leader of this brigade, which Eve Engler points out that the brigade was responsible for killing and dispossessing and looting homes. I don't know how many homes, many homes. And many people died. So that wasn't part of, and I guarantee that's not in the Star article. So there's the media. You can see the media controlling, even if the Star is not Jewish, but it's following an agenda for Zionism. And you can see Dunkelman, his role, and he also he brought a Jewish bride back, Israeli, and lived his life, had many children, and goes back and forth. So, but no one really wants to be just, and no one's going to give up their Canadian passport, I don't think, because ultimately, when push comes to shove, Canada is the promised land, and the U.S., Canada and the U.S. Okay, how are we doing for time? Oh, there's 5 minutes. Okay, great. Now I could go on for hours. In fact, I'd love to do a course on this. I should, but we haven't talked about, this is so important. Okay. There are ironies just all over the place, and there are very important points that I didn't really come to this understanding until I was close to finishing the book, and I put it in the first chapter. So that's often you find the best stuff last. Remember this: when you're going to be fighting the fight for the Palestinians, the Israeli passport is a fraud. Okay, you got that clear? If you don't like fraud, if that's too strong, the Israeli passport is a confidence trick. And what do I mean by that? Well, you look at the Israeli passport nationality, it says what? Israeli. There is no Israeli nationality. There is only a Jewish or a non-Jewish. That is Israelis. That's the Israeli constitution. There is no constitution. There was a law of return. That was the first citizenship law, and that gave Israeli citizenship to all Jews around the world. Okay, so that really, even if you're Jewish, you're automatically a citizen of Israel. Whether you like that or not, they consider you. You might not consider yourself, you might not have taken the passport, you might have denied it, but you are a Jew, so you are an Israeli citizen.
One word for that,
Aliyah, yes. And so that is, it's not on the passport, it's not on your identity card, but it's in your registry. When you try and go and pay taxes, when you try and buy land, when you try and go to university, when you try to do anything, when you try to actually travel, it's much more difficult for Arab Israelis. I mean, they do have a passport, just like Jewish Israelis, but it's a second-class citizenship. It's much harder to travel. You can't buy land. You can't marry a Jew, but then a Jew can't marry a Palestinian either. That's against the law, and you can't. It's illegal to not to say Israel is a Jewish state. If you say Israel is not a Jewish state, that you're breaking the law, basically. So this passport, really, all it is a laissez-passer in the French, the old kind of proto passport. That before there were passports, you just had a piece of paper signed by some count or somebody that says this guy is in good standing, so you can go and travel. That's all it is. It's not a national symbol. That it's a fake. It's a postmodern passport. Everything you can stick postmodern everywhere. So I hope that you can articulate that. And the fact that the only nationality is a Jewish nationality or a non-Jewish. They don't care if you're Palestinian, or if you're Canadian non-Jew, if you're a Christian, or if you're a Baha'i, or if you're a black African. You're all in the same kind of. Well, they do have categories, but the big category is non-Jew. So that is, and that's why it cannot survive as it is now. It's outside of international law. International law says
You're a member of a nation. All nations, you have a constitution, which Israel doesn't have, because if it had a constitution, then it would have to give citizenship to everybody on an equal basis. And good Jews in Israel, good Israelis, have tried to petition. They say, they go to the Supreme Court. Twice they've gone, I want Israeli nationality. I don't want you to call me a Jew or whatever. I just want to be an Israeli. And the Supreme Court says, sorry, you can't, we're a Jewish state. We can't call you anything but an Israeli Jew, because that's your citizenship, and with the emphasis on Jew. So that's a shame. Now, okay, I guess we're probably running out. I keep going, but I wanted to mention this Sunday night. Do any of you watch Sunday Edition, or do you listen to Sunday Edition? Okay, did you hear the blast from Michael Enright? So Michael Enright came out. Well, can you shout it out? What was he talking about?
It was a shameful defense of Israel and the neighbors, etc., etc.
Okay, and basically his line was, anti-Semitism, I don't use that word, it's anti-Jewish. The Semitic is a term it's a linguistics term. So again, I like to change some of the lingo we use. I say anti-Jewish prejudice. We're going to talk about that, or Islamophobia, because they are the Semites, but I'm not worried. Just forget that word at all. It's not useful. So Michael Enright said, anti-Semitism is on the rise because of the hatred of Israel. So he's basically, you put that into real words, that means anti-Jewish sentiment is arising because Israel is identified with Jews. That if you're Jewish, you're automatically identified as a supporter of Israel, and Israel is a pariah state, it's an apartheid state, and I hate that state. So he's saying, okay, you're an anti-Semite if you say that. Well, my mother wears army boots. That's what you've really got is these terms, Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, sticks and stones. Give me an argument. Don't just call me names. So that's Michael Enright. And the picture at CBC, it was astounding. Under the caption was like flu and cockroaches. It never goes away. Anti-Semitism. He's basically accusing people that don't like Israel that we're cockroaches. That's thank you, cockroach. Well, there's someone south of the border that I would call a cockroach, our fearless leader. What did he do a month ago that might cause increased anti-Jewish prejudice? Okay, what did he do? Embassy to Jerusalem. So it's almost either Michael Enright has a sixth sense, knowing that that's going to increase hatred of Israel. I mean, don't need much sixth sense to realize that. Or maybe he got a phone call. Who knows? The way media is controlled. There was one U.S. Senate report that came out in 1962 to investigate Jewish and Israeli Zionist, whatever, if you just call it Zionist, that's fine. Zionist control of the media. And it was astounding what it came out with, that all through the US, any major newspaper had agents basically promoting articles, commissioning special, trying to limit talk on Demona. That was a big thing back in the 70s. Don't talk about Israel's nuclear arsenal. So all of this was kept under cover. And that's continuing today, and it's very powerful in Canada. So when you see these things out of the blue, like Michael Enright, who is generally, never thought of him as, he's a bigot, I would say, by this diatribe that he came out with. Why would he do that? Why would a person demean himself and start, spouting this nonsense? To me, someone that's brave is someone that stands up for the underdog. And I think we know who the underdog here is. Okay, so I guess I've got to, I wish I could have done more about the natives, because that's another, something that, writing this book, I became aware how little I know about our own native heritage, and that's, the rest of my life is going to be really exploring this, meeting with natives. And just in conclusion, I could say I started out being ashamed to be Canadian. Now I'm proud, but I'm proud to be a good Canadian. To identify with natives, to be proud of the communist traditions that we have, and not to be afraid of that word. The Jews that were communists in the 30s were the good Jews. People like Ben Walsh, a labor organizer, and he was asked, "Are you a Zionist?" And he said, "Why would I want to start a new country? This is my country. I want to make life good here for Canadians. I'm a Canadian." So that, to me, is what we have to really encourage, to revive a good nationalism and to try and recapture some kind of control of our foreign policy. And I think that that's why the Palestinian struggle is so important. If we can get online on Palestine, then we can move forward. We can get rid of our bigotry against Russia, against Iran. We can really move forward again on a peaceful policy, because Canada has that tradition. It's not well founded, that we are supposed to be peacekeepers, peaceniks, but I think it's still part of Canadian thinking. And I think we can put more meat on those bones. So that's what I hope we can do, and I encourage you. I've been trying to do that in my own writing.